The 1970s gave us disco, lava lamps, and some of the most hideous cars ever to roll off an assembly line. Buckle up. Today, we're taking a joyride through 18 of the ugliest automotive crimes of the decade. From design disasters to rolling punchlines, these are the cars that made you wonder who signed off on that. Datsun 200SX. Not every fall from grace makes a sound, but this one thudded. At a time when Datsun seemed untouchable, with the 240Z charming sports car fans and the 510 winning over pragmatists, they released the 200SX, a car that looked like it was designed by someone halfway through fixing a toaster. The grille, shaped like a bargain bin electric shaver, set the tone, and things didn't improve from there. Its slab-sided bodywork and lifeless lines felt less like a design choice and more like a default setting. Sure, it had rear-wheel drive and a 2.0L engine on paper, but so does a forklift. Calling it sporty was generous to a fault. It lumbered, it groaned, and it drank gas like it was trying to forget the 70s ever happened. Visibility? Not great. But with so few buyers, complaints were a statistical impossibility. And while most cars aged poorly in this era, the 2000SX disintegrated with a certain poetic urgency. It didn't just rust, it flaked away like shame in the rain. In a decade packed with daring flops and design swings, the 2000SX managed to stand out by doing nothing bold at all, and somehow still doing it badly. A forgettable car that reminds you sometimes mediocrity is the loudest kind of ugly. Leata Cabalero, the Chevy Chevette, was never anyone's dream car. It wheezed, rattled, and accelerated like it had second thoughts. But for all its flaws, at least it wasn't trying to win any beauty contests. That is, until Donald E. Steinball from Post Falls decided it needed a glow-up. Armed with a drum of Bondo, an ocean of fiberglass, and questionable taste, he transformed the humble Chevette into the Caballero, a name he claimed was for his wife, though it sounds more like a typo in a teleprompter script. His vision combined the body lines of a first-gen Monte Carlo with the proportions of a toaster oven. The result? A rolling contradiction. Long in the nose, short in sense. And somehow this wasn't a one-off. Steinball actually managed to crank out nearly 100 of these Frankensteins, including a few El Camino-style pickups that looked like they'd lost a bet with common sense. He priced them at nearly double what a stock Chevette cost, which might explain why the project ended in financial disaster. Then again, naming your automotive side hustle after your spouse and gluing on a fake muscle car front end? Some losses are harder to measure in dollars. Bricklin SV-1. Some people leave their mark on the automotive world. Malcolm Bricklin left a dent. After introducing the American public to the Subaru 360 and later the Yugo, two cars that made used skateboards look like luxury transport, you'd think he'd call it a day. Instead, he gave us the Bricklin SV-1, a plastic-clad, gull-wing-doored curiosity that was marketed as a safety sports car. It turned out to be about as safe and sporty as a folding chair in a hurricane. The design tried to be bold, but landed somewhere between concept car and kid's toy left out in the sun. It featured exaggerated bumpers that looked vacuum-formed by a cartoonist, tiny slit-like windows that gave off spy movie prop energy, and turbine-style wheels straight out of a 1970s Van Mural fantasy. Functionally, the SV-1 was a mess. Panels warped before they even made it to the chassis. Gull-wing doors weighed a solid 90 pounds and occasionally refused to open, leaving unlucky owners trapped inside their own plastic panic rooms. And don't even ask about the electrical system unless you're near a fire extinguisher. The SV-1 had one consistent quality: disappointment. It was hard to look at, harder to drive, and nearly impossible to take seriously. Buick Riviera. How do you take one of the best-looking American coupes of the late 60s and turn it into something that looks like it's melting in the sun? That's the riddle Buick answered unintentionally in 1970 with the second-generation Riviera. From 1966 to 1969, the Riviera had real presence, taut lines, hidden headlights, and a muscular stance that exuded quiet confidence. Then came the redesign, and suddenly it looked like it had aged 40 years overnight. The grille appeared to be slowly sliding off the front end, as if gravity had declared war on it. The rear wheel arches were smothered under odd-looking fender skirts that grew over the tires like creeping ivy. The proportions turned doughy and waterlogged, giving the whole car a sluggish, marshy vibe. Less street cruiser, more landlocked houseboat. Naturally, customers noticed. Riviera sales, which had been climbing steadily, fell off a cliff when this swollen, confused-looking version landed in showrooms. The public's verdict was clear. Beauty might be skin deep, but ugly cut straight to the bottom line. Thankfully, Buick rebounded quickly. By 1971, the Riviera had reinvented itself again, this time with the polarizing but unforgettable boat tail design. Love it or not, at least it stopped looking like it was melting. Ford Thunderbird. What happens when a car company forgets that subtlety can be a good thing? You get the 1970 Ford Thunderbird, a vehicle that went from smooth and sophisticated to looking like it lost a fight with a pelican. The late 60s T-Birds weren't showstoppers, but they had a certain low-key charm. They didn't try too hard. They didn't need to. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Ford designers slapped a giant chrome beak on the front end, as if the car had aspirations of becoming a bird of prey, or at least cosplaying one. The nose jutted out with such theatrical drama, it practically demanded its own zip code. Suddenly, the once dignified T-Bird had the awkward energy of a dinner guest who talks too loud and doesn't know when to leave. The real irony, Thunderbird was meant to evoke power, elegance, even mystique. What we got in 1970 looked more like a rolling cartoon. Heavy up front, disconnected in the rear, and confused all the way through. Sales held steady for a bit, but the styling misstep was a sign of things to come. The T-Bird never quite found its footing again, proving that sometimes bold just turns into bizarre. AMC Pacer. Few cars from the 1970s tried harder to be different than the AMC Pacer, and few ended up looking quite so unintentionally hilarious. At first glance, it resembles something you'd expect to see in an animated movie, not parked in a real driveway. With its oversized glass bubble and pudgy compact body, the Pacer looked less like a car and more like a science experiment that escaped the lab. AMC pitched it as the first wide small car, hoping to stand out in a growing field of imports. And stand out it did, like a goldfish tank on wheels. The panoramic glass was meant to offer improved visibility, but it mostly offered heat stroke inside. Summer felt like sitting in a greenhouse with wheels. By 1978, the design team doubled down on the awkwardness by shoehorning in an optional V8. This required a taller, bulkier hood and upright grille, giving the car a strange, puffed-up look, as if it had eaten a second lunch and hadn't quite digested it. Efficiency, unsurprisingly, wasn't its strength. Still, the Pacer carved out a weird little cult following. It was a car for misfits, well before misfits were cool, and long before anyone knew what a quirky classic really meant. Volvo 262C. Every now and then, a car gets built, not because the world needs it, but because someone got a little too inspired during an overseas visit. That's more or less how the Volvo 262C came to be. Legend has it that when Henry Ford II showed up in Sweden with a fleet of Lincoln Continental Mark IVs, local execs were so dazzled by the square-jawed luxury coupes that they decided we should make one our way. The result? A strangely squat two-door Volvo with all the grace of a brick in a tuxedo. Volvo took its respectable 262G Coupe, shipped it to Bertone in Italy, and asked them to chop the roofline by over 2.5 inches. The outcome was a car that looked perpetually hunched, like it was ducking under a low ceiling. Headroom only if you were under 6 feet or willing to drive with your neck at a 45-degree angle. To Volvo's credit, the interior was plush. Leather seats, wood trim, even a dash of Italian flair. But no amount of luxury could distract from the oddly proportioned body. And yet somehow they sold over 6,000 of them. Proof that even questionable ideas can find their audience, especially if they're seated low enough. Oldsmobile Cutlass Aeroback. Somewhere in a GM boardroom in the late 70s, someone must have said, "Let's give America a taste of European flair." And apparently, that taste came in the form of the Aeroback, a car that looked like it was styled by someone who'd only seen hatchbacks described over the phone. In GM's attempt to go continental, they took the successful Cutlass and Buick Century and gave them a sloping rear that wasn't quite a fastback, definitely not a hatchback, and somehow still managed to look like both were melting. Technically, it had a regular trunk lid, but by the time customers figured that out, most had already turned and walked away. GM was so confident in the Aeroback's appeal that they didn't even bother offering a proper sedan version at launch. That confidence evaporated fast, sales fizzled, and GM scrambled to push a more conventional design into production by 1980. Oddly, the two-door Aeroback lingered until 1981, like the last guest at a party who doesn't realize the music stopped an hour ago. In the end, the Aeroback became a cautionary tale. When you mix bland ambition with clumsy execution, what you get isn't innovation, it's just awkward. And that, in a nutshell, is how the 80s styling slump began. British Leyland Princess. How bad does a car have to be before even its parent company doesn't want to put its name on it? Enter the British Leyland Princess, a vehicle so unloved it had to become its own brand just to avoid embarrassing the others. Initially launched under Austin, Morris, and Wolseley, the Princess eventually stood alone, not because it earned the spotlight, but because everyone else quietly backed away. Its wedge-shaped body looked like it was styled with a ruler and a grudge. At first glance, you'd think it was a hatchback, but no. This was a sedan in disguise, hiding a laughably small trunk opening that made loading groceries feel like a game of Tetris on hard mode. Combine that with its awkward proportions and questionable reliability, and you had a car that failed at form, function, and common sense. To make matters worse, the Princess rolled onto the scene right as British Leyland was crumbling from within. Mechanical issues, poor build quality, and union troubles created the perfect storm, and the Princess was caught in the middle. In the end, the car's name might have suggested grace or elegance, but let's be honest, the only royal thing about it was the mess it left behind. AMC Gremlin. Few cars have ever looked quite as unfinished as the AMC Gremlin, and that seemed to be the point. Introduced in 1970, it appeared as though AMC designers started with a normal compact, then simply ran out of paper halfway through the rear end. The result? A car that looked like someone had sliced it with a giant paper cutter, then shrugged and sent it to production anyway. And yet, beneath its awkward, chopped-off silhouette was a strangely brilliant idea. The Gremlin was affordable, practical in its own lopsided way, and cheap to manufacture. AMC beat the Big Three to the punch in the subcompact race, offering it at a price nearly 1/3 less than its rivals. That alone made it a hit by AMC standards, even a phenomenon. Of course, being a sales success doesn't mean being easy on the eyes. The Gremlin's proportions were borderline comedic, with a long hood, short wheelbase, and a back end that looked like it left the factory mid-transformation. Word has it, AMC rejected an even uglier design before settling on this one. Though, considering you made that call, we'd take that claim with a grain of irony. Still, the Gremlin was unapologetically weird, and in the 70s, that was a superpower. Porsche 914. Not every Porsche looks like it's about to grace the cover of a magazine, and the 914 made sure of that. Released in the early 70s, it was the kind of sports car that turned heads, though not always for the right reasons. From certain angles, it looked less like a product of Stuttgart and more like a high school shop class project that got surprisingly far. To its credit, the 914 was a bold experiment, a mid-engine layout in a compact, affordable package. But styling-wise, it walked a strange line between European minimalist and unfinished prototype. The greenhouse was pulled back awkwardly. The bodywork looked like it had been trimmed with a T-square, and the space between the rear wheels and B-pillars stretched on like a design afterthought. There was no mistaking it for a 911 or anything else, really. It didn't try to be sleek or sensual. Instead, it leaned into its angular awkwardness like a dorky kid at prom who decided to dance anyway. And somehow, that gave it charm. We'll admit it, the 914 isn't a car you dream about as a kid. But years later, you might catch yourself smiling when you see one. It's weird, it's honest, and oddly enough, it works. Saab Sonett III. Did someone forget to tell Saab that balance is kind of important in car design? Because when the Sonett III rolled into the early 70s, it looked like two completely different cars had been welded together during a lunch break. Built with the American market in mind, the Sonett tried to appeal to US tastes, but ended up misreading the assignment in the most spectacular way. Let's start with the nose. It was long, really long, like the automotive equivalent of someone leaning way too far into a conversation. That giant overhang, exaggerated even further by a clunky 5 miles per hour safety bumper, gave the front end a droopy, drooling look. Then there was the rear, short, stubby, and abruptly chopped off, like it left the factory before the designers could finish it. This front-heavy, rear-starved layout threw the whole car's visual balance out the window. And while the Sonett's sporty intentions were genuine, the styling made it hard to take seriously, especially in a market packed with sharper, more cohesive designs. It wouldn't be until the Saab 900 arrived later in the decade that American buyers finally started giving the brand a second look. By then, the Sonett had already driven off into the land of automotive oddities. Reliant Robin. This wasn't just a car, it was a cry for help on wheels. The Reliant Robin, Britain's most infamous three-wheeler, looked like what happens when someone tries to build a car using only memory, cardboard, and a prayer. While three-wheel vehicles can, in theory, be quirky and even charming, the Robin leaned fully into its awkwardness and then doubled down with a wobbly stance and a blank, bug-eyed stare. It wasn't just the looks, though those didn't help. The Robin's narrow front end and high roofline made it resemble a wind-up toy blown up to adult scale. Its predecessor, the Reliant Regal, at least had a faint whisper of dignity in its lines. But the Robin felt like it knew it wasn't a real car and had simply decided to own it. Built for buyers on a tight budget and a loophole in British licensing laws, the Robin technically offered motoring freedom. What it offered in practice was the terrifying sensation of tipping over during a sharp turn and the social status of a shopping cart with a VIN. Still, there's something oddly lovable about how hard it tries. It's not pretty, it's not practical, but in its own clumsy, three-legged way, it's unforgettable. Leyland P76. Can bad design be exported like a cultural artifact? Apparently so, because when British Leyland brought the P76 to Australia, it didn't just ship a car. it delivered a rolling case study in how not to build one. This full-size sedan was supposed to be Leyland Australia's bold entry into the local market, but it ended up feeling more like a prank that got out of hand. Visually, the P76 was all sharp angles and strange proportions, like someone tried to draw a wedge using only guesswork and resentment. Sure, it had a party trick. The trunk could reportedly fit a 44-gallon oil drum, useful perhaps if you were smuggling a barbecue pit, but that spacious cargo area couldn't distract from the slapdash assembly and flimsy build quality, hallmarks of Leyland's declining empire. Under the hood, there were some interesting powertrain choices, but the appeal ended there. Squeaks, rattles, and electrical gremlins turned everyday driving into an exercise in lowered expectations. In just 2 years, the P76 flamed out after barely 18,000 units. It wasn't just ugly. It was a symbol of a brand unraveling at the seams. If the goal was to unify the Commonwealth through shared automotive disappointment, well, mission accomplished. Which 70s car do you think should have made this list but didn't? Let us know in the comments. Subaru GL Coupe style can be a risky experiment, especially when your background is all lab coats and calculators. In the early 70s, Subaru had carved out a reputation in the US for building dependable, no-frills compacts. They weren't flashy, but they got the job done, like the automotive equivalent of a rice cooker. But then someone at Subaru must have looked over at a Datsun brochure and said, "We can be cool too." The result? The Subaru GL Coupe. This was Subaru's attempt at styling, but the proportions ended up looking more like an accident than a design statement. The front was oddly upright. The body seemed stretched in strange places. And then, suddenly, it just ended. The rear overhang was so short, you'd think they ran out of metal halfway through and just slapped on a bumper to call it done. To make matters worse, the taillights looked like leftover parts from a vending machine. From the side, the GL resembled a car that had been compressed lengthwise during shipping and never fully bounced back. Sure, it was practical, affordable, and reliable. But in trying to be stylish, it lost the very charm that made early Subarus lovable, and gained a design that looked like it had been faxed and blurry. Sebring-Vanguard CitiCar. Can a car be both ahead of its time and completely ridiculous? Meet the CitiCar, a bold attempt at electric mobility in the 1970s that somehow managed to feel futuristic and laughable at the same time. Built by Sebring-Vanguard, a name that sounds more like a yacht club than a car company, the CitiCar looked like something you'd see patrolling a warehouse floor, not merging onto a freeway. Its wedge-shaped body seemed designed with a protractor and a budget of maybe $40. Under the hood, well, technically under the seat, you got a 2.5 horsepower electric motor, later upgraded to a thundering 6. Top speed, a heart-racing 28 miles per hour. Assuming you had a tailwind and no dignity to lose. Range was limited, the interior was Spartan, and safety features were mostly theoretical. Yet, despite all that, someone thought it was a good idea to extend the bumpers and rebrand it as the commuter car, because apparently, the only thing missing was a bit more awkward. And still, you can't help but admire its ambition. The CitiCar didn't just challenge convention, it bulldozed right past it in the slow lane. In a strange way, it paved the path for the EVs we know today by showing everyone exactly what not to do first. Vanden Plas 1500 luxury isn't always about what's under the hood. Sometimes, it's just about distracting you from it. That was the philosophy behind the Vanden Plas 1500, British Leyland's attempt to disguise the deeply mediocre Austin Allegro in a tailored suit. They didn't improve the engineering, the handling, or the reliability. Instead, but beneath the veneer, it was still the same awkward, underpowered Allegro. It rattled, it groaned, and it cornered like a filing cabinet on roller skates. The fancy nameplate didn't change the fact that it was badge engineering at its most shameless. In the end, the Vanden Plas 1500 was less a luxury experience and more a case study in automotive overcompensation. A Jaguar for those with champagne dreams and lukewarm tea budgets. Ford Mustang II. Some cars try to be everything at once and end up being nothing at all. That was the unfortunate fate of the Mustang II Ghia, Ford's attempt to dress muscle in a tuxedo and hope no one noticed it skipped leg day. After downsizing the iconic Mustang in the mid-70s, Ford figured they could win over the luxury crowd by slapping on a padded vinyl roof, opera windows, and color-matched bumpers. The result? A coupe that looked less like a pony car and more like something your aunt might drive to bridge night. Visually, the Ghia trim felt like a collage of every odd styling cue from the era. The faux formal roofline gave it the presence of a shrunken Lincoln, while the wheel covers, borrowed from the Granada no less, made it clear that even the parts bin was uninspired. It didn't look fast, it didn't look sleek, and it certainly didn't look proud to wear the Mustang name. And yet, the Mustang II sold surprisingly well. But let's be honest, that success probably had more to do with timing, fuel prices, and badge loyalty than with any real admiration for the Ghia's styling choices. Call it a Mustang if you must, but don't expect it to gallop. Don't forget to subscribe and share your remembers with someone who would love to learn more about this fascinating era. As always, thank you so much for watching.